also put on a custom background. Hold on, I have.
Oh, cool. Yeah, go ahead.
Really good, actually. So virtual background.
Oh, is
awesome.
It the cover?
It's the cover of Fast Company.
Oh, nice. I was
cool.
to ask you. Hello, welcome everyone who's tuning in. So great to see you guys. Feel free to turn on. Oh, nice, fancy.
Wow, that's very fancy. I love this.
Cover of the magazine. I love it.
Yeah. So
brand.
that's amazing. So we are super excited to get started with our next Changemaker Coffee Chat. We are thrilled to have Liz Segran on our as our co-host of this coffee chat. She's a great friend of Brightly's and of all things sustainability related. So if you've read an article on the impact that fashion is having on the planet, or just general sustainability trends in general in the past year, I can almost guarantee it was written by Liz. And I'm not just saying that. She does some awesome reporting for Fast Company, and she recently released a book, which I'm sure she'll chat a little bit about. I think, you know, in times like these, we're always looking for new books to read. And I think the tips shared in it are very actionable and amazing for just general life right now. So I for some reason, we're having issues with Facebook like we did last time. So I'm going to go keep messing with that. So I'm going to kind of let Lisa take things from here, and we will try and get this thing to work on Facebook best we can.
Yeah, and if not, we always repost the videos now on YouTube as well, and we'll repost the recording of the video inside the group on our Facebook page, and so everyone can tune in. Awesome. So Liz, why don't you start with a brief introduction about yourself and about the book? If you have a physical copy of the book, feel free to show it too. I want everyone to see it, and then we'll get into the questions, because today we're talking about, sorry, my Slack is firing up. I will mute it for a second. Yeah, Brightly Scouts are tuning in just a second. I'll help them find the link. But yeah, we're celebrating Earth Day today, and today Earth Day is turning 50 years old, so that's what we will be talking about, and also talking about how we can and should be celebrating Earth Day given the current COVID-19 state of the world. But Elise, I'll give it off to you.
Hi, it's nice to to be here with all of you virtually on this chat. I am Liz Segran, Elizabeth Segran. I write for Fast Company, as you can see, and write about the fashion industry. And over the last couple of years, I've been most interested in issues of sustainability, which I think everybody, you know, everybody in the whole world is thinking about it at this point, or at least before coronavirus hit. I'm also the author of a new book. It's called, ooh, can you see it? Is it coming through? It's called The Rocket Years: How Your 20s Launch the Rest of Your Life. And it's really a book about the big decisions that we make in our 20s and how they play out throughout our lives. It's a book, obviously, that is relevant to people in their 20s, but the big secret with the book is that I actually wrote it for myself, and I'm in my late 30s, entering my 40s, and I really think that our 20s are this fascinating, magical period in our lives where we essentially write our own origin stories about who we are and what we want from life. And I think that revisiting those years and understanding the decisions that we made in those years can be so crucial for understanding where we are at whatever stage we are. Because if we can reconnect with our, you know, the great passions and the great ambitions of our youth, it's, you know, it's easier to sort of make sense of what you want to do with your life now. And so that's my book. And actually, a lot of what I talk about in this book has to do with things like habit formation, because in our 20s, we basically, you know, we're in this period where, you know, we've left our childhood habits and, you know, in our home, and we're basically creating not just our identities, but the habits that we will take with us through life. So I look at things like activism and, you know, passion projects. And I actually think that that's super relevant to the we're having now, because I think there's an entire generation of young people who are concerned about the state of the planet, and they're deeply aware of their own responsibility in terms of trying to be right, as this conversation is focused on. And so I think we have this amazing opportunity to cultivate habits and and ambitions that have to do with sustainability that could have an impact on our future, right? The habits that we create and the passions we pursue now can have a huge impact on what happens in the future. So that's how my book and my magazine all come together. Yeah, well, it's nice to be here. Oh, I think
Lisa, you're muted.
A lot of folks are tuning in, and yeah, we have we're troubleshooting some of the Zoom problems. I don't know, some people are having trouble with that too, but we're recording, so we're good. And I think most people are figuring out how to get in. That's why I was a bit distracted. But yeah, let's talk about, and again, this will be a fluid discussion. I have some questions, but if you guys have any questions for Liz or just in general, or have any resources or ideas you want to share, always welcome to drop them in the chat for everyone to see, or you can also just unmute yourself and politely interrupt. That's totally fine. We all are pros in using Zoom these days, I guess. All right, so yeah, Earth Day is celebrating 50 years today. So Liz, I was wondering, what are your thoughts on celebrating Earth Day during COVID-19? Did COVID-19 made us more aware of the importance of taking care of our planet? How is it different? How should we be thinking differently about Earth Day and taking care of our planet in general?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I've been thinking a lot about how these two crises come together, the crisis that our planet is facing and the current, public health crisis. And I think that the way that we're able to harness this moment in order to create a more sustainable future has a lot to do with who's to do that. Because right now I'm seeing a lot of interesting trends. As a fashion reporter, I've been looking at all of the the most recent spending data, and consumer spending on fashion products and just on consumer goods in general has gone down tremendously over the last month, and it's going to keep going down this month, and is probably going to continue going down over the next couple of months. And all of this is obviously propelled by the crisis with being unable to shop. But I think that there's an element of habit formation. As I was mentioning before, I've been thinking about habit formation a lot because of my book. And I think that it's possible that, eventually, we're going to come out of this and realize that we didn't need to be buying as much stuff as we had been buying pre-crisis, that we might adjust to a new normal in terms of, the clothes that we have. And basically, I think that there's a general agreement that the environmental crisis that we're finding ourselves in was really a product of overconsumption that has been happening, basically since the Great Depression, right? And so it's possible that another Great Depression, which it sounds like we're on our way to, might have the effect of helping us reverse some of that overconsumption. Obviously, it's coming at a terrible time and with a terrible human toll. So I'm not saying that it's a good thing that all of this is happening, but I am saying that perhaps we could try and take advantage of the changes in behavior to sort of move towards a world where we're all consuming less. I think that would be a really great thing. But I think that really depends on people being proactive about that and being very deliberate about these decisions, about journalists writing about this, about brands making this argument. I think otherwise, because the point is that this reduction in consumption is not driven by people's awareness about the environment. It's because of other things unrelated to that. If we could try and talk about it and help people consciously shift their consumption habits, that could be a really great thing. So that's what I think could be one way that this crisis helps us move towards a more sustainable future. My concern is that, before all of this, there were really, really huge initiatives that were taking place that were necessary basically to shift our entire infrastructure to make it more sustainable. So there were companies that were working towards understanding their carbon footprint, for instance. That was a very expensive and large scale effort. There were lots of things that were, and my concern is that when the economy is in such a bad state and everything is basically disrupted, that some of these bigger important initiatives will also get disrupted. And so, and that's a big concern that I have. But yeah, I think those are starting this conversation about COVID and the planet, I think that those are the two things that that sort of like bookend this discussion.
Yeah, and we've mentioned, or we've talked briefly about this on the podcast. Me and Liz chatted probably like 3-4 weeks ago, which seems like a generation ago. Things were very different back then. But I think you made me first realize and kind of helped me think kind of more on the macro level about this crisis. And it's like with Brightly, we are kind of realizing that too. And of course, like we've had more time to think and analyze what's happening and to understand what it can mean for the humanity going forward. We see COVID-19 is essentially as a global reset, and at Brightly we like to be positive about it and finding silver linings. But I think our response as human beings has been great, and especially in the consumer end. When we said, like in the beginning of 2020, we were like, sustainability is not an issue anymore, it's a norm, and look at all these amazing sustainable brands growing so rapidly. But then COVID-19 hit, and unfortunately ethical brands, especially fashion brands, are being hit by quite a lot. But at the same time, I think we as consumers and human beings, for the first time in a while, we just had time to slow down and to actually think about how we're buying. And what we're seeing, people like, they really, really understand how important their buying habits are and how important it is to vote with their dollars. And so they're supporting local businesses, buying books not from Amazon, but from local bookstores or their online sites, so like companies like Bookshop. They're trying to support their local restaurants. They're trying to support just like any extra money they have. Hopefully they're spending with the ethical companies. So this has been really exciting. So you kind of briefly mentioned that already, but how do you see, like on the macro level, when we come out of this crisis, when we will, as a humanity, how it will be different, maybe even outside of like ethical fashion, conscious consumption, just like on a macro level?
Yeah, I think that we're kind of adjusting to a lot of norms. So at Fast Company, we've been exploring how this crisis could permanently change society in a number of ways. And I think it's really fascinating hearing about all of that. But, there's a lot of different things that were basically in motion before the new norm. So I think teleworking was something that a lot of companies were exploring. It can reduce the costs of owning real estate. It allows for a lot more flexibility for workers, and that might become the new norm. I mean, clearly many companies are able to do business entirely remotely. And so that's one thing. And travel as well, I mean, has been totally disrupted by this. And I think there was a lot of travel that we thought was, actually has proven clearly not to be, right? Because we're being forced to do a lot of stuff virtually. And I actually think that both of those things have enormous consequences on the environment. If we're not commuting as much to get to work, and if we're not commuting as much, when we're traveling, if we're able to effectively make conferences virtual and get as much out of them as we got from going to conferences, for instance, we could shift the world, right? I mean, all of this could have a huge impact on the carbon emissions from vehicles and air travel. I mean, that could be really, really huge. And then also, as we mentioned on the conversation, I do think that there has been this shift in mentality. I mean, for the last few decades, the way that we've been thinking about consumption in general has been one of excess, that there's like an unlimited amount of stuff. to in the world, and an unlimited number of resources and so on, right? And I think with all of this, we've shifted to a mindset of scarcity. A lot of us are, you know, sort of instinctively thinking about how to preserve our resources, how to make, you know, our rolls of paper towel last longer. I mean, at my house, you know, I've been single-handedly trying to convince all of my, you know, my entire family to using like reusable kitchen towels, right? Or essentially like, you know, like they're called European cloths, I think. And my husband hasn't been into it. And now that we have a limited supply of kitchen towels and we don't want to, you know, buy more, we don't want to have to go to the store to buy more, he's come around. So that's just one tiny example, but I think multiplied by everybody in the United States, like this has the potential to change in general into a different mindset.
Yeah, I totally agree. I feel like the way people are thinking about what's happening right now has just completely changed the way they think about everything. And so it's, you know, we like to say it's a good thing coming out of a very bad situation. But, you know, I'm wondering too, Liz, if there are ways that you have found that people can like get involved in spreading the word about eco-friendly living while they're at home. Like, you know, I know a lot of people, for instance, on Earth Day, like to go out and do beach cleanups, which I don't know how many folks are doing that right now. I assume you could probably do that if you kept 6 feet away from people with your mask and everything on, but I don't really think they have organized such things now, right? So would be curious to think a little bit about that too.
Yeah, so one thing that I've been thinking a lot about is we actually are, so we're at home. A lot of us are consuming less in many ways. We're thinking about scarcity. We're also a lot more aware of the amount of trash we're producing, because, you know, usually when you throw out disposable items or things that you want to, you know, trash basically throughout the day, it goes into a lot of different trash bins, right? The trash bin at work, you know, you know, municipal trash bins and so on. But at home, you're able to sort of document and see exactly how much waste you're producing. Mm-hmm. And so I think that is pretty instructive. And I think that maybe like this is a moment for us all to reckon with how much we're throwing out every day, and maybe like talking about that, maybe, you know, helping one another make sense of that. The other interesting thing that has come out of this is that a lot of initiatives that have been focused on getting rid of single-use plastics and other things like that have been sort of thrown out the window because people think it's more more hygienic to just use you know, disposable items, right, in the midst of a pandemic. And I don't know what the science on that is. It's possible that that's the case, but I do think that we are perhaps sort of falling behind a little bit on thinking about how to use reusable items. And so I think that's another issue that we can be drawing attention to and maybe talking about, or maybe just learning more about. I do think that it's good that, you know, with this whole mask, this policy where, you know, Americans have been asked to wear masks, a lot of people have, instead of using disposable masks, which were pretty common, I think, in many parts of the world where people wore masks more frequently, like in Asia, people have been making homemade masks, stuff that they found around their houses. And so that I think was a good thing, because a lot of these masks are washable, reusable. So that's one potentially enormous source of waste that we've curbed. But I hope that kind of DIY, like reusing the, you know, the old t-shirts in your closet for new purposes, I hope that could, you know, extend to other things that we're doing. Hopefully that approach will sort of like change the way that we think in other ways as well.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, this is all about the mindset. Like, this is all about the slowing down. Like, we've been forced to slow down and to like really look what resources we have around the house, and then suddenly, we're thinking differently. And yeah, we had Catherine Kellogg last week on our coffee chat. She is the founder of Going Zero Waste, so she has a lot of tips. And we had a previous podcast episode with her. But again, zero waste. I feel like it's already, I think, definitely having a moment. But again, with this current crisis, we started thinking more creatively, and finally realized the scarcity of resources that we have around the house. Another question we had, it's kind of connected with your book. Why is it important to develop eco-friendly habits and behaviors early and often, and how you can either do it as a parent or how you should be thinking as a person yourself, either if you're in your 20s or 30s and beyond?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so for those of you on Facebook or who joined later, I'm a staff writer at Fast Company where I cover fashion, and I'm also the author of a new book called The Rocket Years: How Your 20s Launch the Rest of Your Life. And as I mentioned before, it's a book about the big decisions you make in your 20s. And it's also an opportunity for those of us who are not in our 20s to go back and revisit those years to reconnect with our passions and our ambitions. But as I mentioned before, yeah, we focus a lot on, I focus a lot in the book on habit formation, because there are so many habits that we create, well, we don't even realize that we're creating in our 20s, that have an impact on our entire life. And so they have to do with things like, like our fitness habits, our routines, the things that we do at home, to how well we are, how good we are at maintaining relationships and building friendships. And I have a whole chapter on activism, which I think is profoundly related to the conversation that we're having right now. But basically, there are two insights that I had in the book. The first is that when you're under the age of 25, your brain is still very plastic, which means that it's much easier for you to learn new skills and new habits, and for them to become, for you to pick them up quickly, and for those to become part of your life. And as you get older, it's definitely possible to continue picking up those habits and routines and so on. But you have to work harder at it. And I think a lot of people tend to get frustrated when it's harder for them to pick up a new skill or habit later. And so people tend to give up much more easily. And so that's not to say it's still very important for us to be continuing to develop good habits later. It's just harder in those years. So that's the first insight I had. But the second is that actually a lot of our behaviors are habit driven. So you think about something like activism, and if you think about politics, for instance, something like voting, we think about voting as like a civic duty and all that, but it's also a habit. You need to learn a lot of skills in order to vote for the very first time. And then after you do that 2 or 3 times, it becomes a habit. And you basically have to get to that point to become a regular voter. And so people talk in lofty terms about like how good it is to be civically engaged. But in a lot of ways, it's just a matter of getting over the hump of developing a new habit. And that's true for a lot of things in our life, like making friends. That's a skill. And when we're younger, we don't often realize that we're making friends because it happens so naturally. But actually, there's a lot of skills involved with meeting new people and connecting with them and building those relationships. And as we get older, friend making becomes harder, and that skill, we can get very rusty at it, right? And so anyway, there are many aspects of life that are habit driven. And I think sustainability is definitely one of them. And I've seen this for myself. I grew up in many parts of the world because of my father's job. And in many of them, sustainability was not something that people were thinking a lot about, and so I have had to develop a lot of habits later. When I'm about it, and when I'm in the right frame of mind, it's for me to feel like, doing the most sustainable. But a lot of the time when we're tired or when we're not focused on these issues, or when we're busy, we revert back to whatever habits we had before. And it's easy to sort of give up on the sustainability aspect, the sustainability habits that we were building. So therefore, I think that it's really important for us to cultivate, habits when we're young around sustainability. And that's why I'm so encouraged that so many young people are so concerned about the environment, because it's not just about their idealism and their passion. It's also a matter of them developing the skills and habits necessary to become, sustainable adults and, throughout their lives, right? But also, I just think that, it's just, habits can be formed when we're older. It's just harder. And so I think that just being aware of that, being aware that it's challenging to change our behaviors as adults, can inspire that if you're in your 30s, 40s, 50s, it's just hard. And so if you find yourself falling back to other patterns, then know that that's totally natural and that it's really important for you to keep pushing forward.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, and I think we're all aware. I mean, depending on how old we are, that it's definitely more difficult to make friends, and even in your 30s, and suddenly going to yoga class, you have to push yourself more, and all of that stuff.
I hear you.
We have a question from Laura Byler, one of Brightly's ambassadors, scouts. So Laura's question is about your comment on scarcity mentality. When we return to normal, people will want to move out of the scarcity mentality, as that is often reactive behavior. How do we help people shift their feelings of resourcefulness and sustainability to a mentality of abundance, to help keep new routines that are eco-friendly and not revert? Yeah, that's a great question, Laura.
Yeah, I've spoken to a bunch of different experts, and some are concerned that basically after a prolonged period of scarcity, there's this kind of rebound effect where people sort of want to kind of, consume more, basically, so go out and go crazy. And that's one aspect. I think part of it has to do with how long we're in this period of scarcity, because during the Great Depression, for instance, that lasted a decade. And it's possible that the current recession that we're in could last time. And it's possible these stories about people who grew up in the Great Depression, and even when they were very old, and the economy was fine, they still had this mentality. So it's an open question whether whether we're going to shift our mentality back to overconsumption. In fact, we might go way over, what we were consuming before, or whether we're going to maintain these habits. I do think that there are ways that we can actively try and leverage the moment that we're in to try and change people's thinking about this. One thing is thinking about how much money we're saving and how much and where we can spend that money. I've been surprised checking my bank account, and my spending, my credit card spending. I have been spending so much less than I was spending before. And it's hard for me to understand exactly why, because I work from home. So I think I'm just cutting back on a lot of spending that I wasn't even aware of, and just thinking about how I can use that money differently for things from just goods that I was kind of wasting money on, because I don't even notice that they're not in my life anymore. Trying to think about this in sort of positive ways, right? Like talking about all the money that people will save during this period and what they could put that to, maybe putting them towards passion projects or towards causes that they really support and they're really excited about, for instance. And then just kind of, I think that we often, those of us who are thinking about sustainability and environmental issues, they're sort of negative ways of thinking about it and positive ways of thinking about it, right? And I think scarcity is kind of a very, it's kind of a very negative term to be using. I brought that term up, and I think that we've shifted it to this new approach, right? But I think that maybe what we can do is talk about how, this is actually a very good thing, right? That this mentality of scarcity is actually is also actually a mentality of abundance in other ways, right? Like we're seeing how little, you know, how like entire cities have are visible now that used to be in you know, covered in smog. We're seeing how carbon emissions might be going down this year. It is, in some ways, it's a mentality of scarcity in terms of like our personal consumption. But if you think about like the abundance that this is creating in the natural world, I mean, that's another way, it's kind of a better framing of it, I think. So I think we can remarket the concept that I raised in a positive way.
For sure. Yeah, well, interesting part, and that what made me concerned with Laura's question was, I think when the government distributed the first personal loans paycheck program, like last week, actually a lot of brands saw a big spike in sales, kind of proving that we might see like a big rebound of consumption. But yeah, how we as ethical brand founders, as activists, can kind of reposition this conversation again without guilt tripping anyone, you know, that's always important part of Brightless conversation. So we're getting a few questions from Facebook. I will read them in a second. And yeah, you guys also feel free to jump in with questions here, unmute yourself or post them in the chat as well. Alrighty, so one question from Katie Bell. Do you think the way we show gratitude for our friends and the planet will change due to COVID-19?
The way that we show gratitude,
Yeah.
I do actually, because I do think that this is fundamentally changing relationships. I think that being apart from people, you know, physically is forcing us to, basically, I think that this entire crisis is forcing us to really understand what matters to us on so many different levels. I think that moments of crises really do that. Like, and I think about this in my book as well. Like our 20s are big turning points in crises, and I think that those are important learning moments. And I kind of see the current moment that we're in this lens as well, that we're learning so much. And so I think that we're thinking about human relationships in new ways and really valuing things that we took for granted before and relationships that we took for granted before. At the same time, I think that we are sort of forced to, and as a result, to answer your question, and as a result, I think we're much more grateful for those relationships, right? It makes us think about gratitude differently, right? We're thinking about what we are grateful for in those relationships. And then in terms of kind of the way that changing, I think a lot of us are sort of turning to technologies in new ways to foster relationships. So like, for instance, my daughter and, you know, her two grandmothers, they've been reading together every week and appreciating each other in new ways that they didn't have before. And I mean, in some way, you know, one of her grandparents lives in Atlanta and was always there. But this has kind of forced us to sort of like appreciate the people in our lives, knowing that they're so, that relationships and people, you know, we're so fragile in so many ways, right? And it's forcing us to try and think like, how can we try and maximize the amount of time we spend with them? So I think that this is giving us an entirely new appreciation for humans and people. And I think that that's a good thing. In terms of our planet, I actually think it's a very similar narrative because we are seeing in a lot of ways where our stuff comes from, right? I think that a lot of us, because of supply chain disruptions, we are seeing that, you know, our food was placed on shelves by people, right? And it was grown by people. And if anybody along that chain gets sick, we're not going to have access to a food on our table. And basically we're sort of connected a little bit more to even deeper than that, like the source of everything that we have, like our food, our clothes, all of that, everything is getting disrupted now. So it's forcing us to think beyond our simple ability to click and buy something, going to a store and buy something. And so I think that, yeah, I think that people are thinking more about where their stuff comes from. And I hope that this is making them feel a deeper appreciation for the planet, which gives us all of this good stuff. And also the people who create these products that we use every day.
Yeah, I love that. I think it's just such a great way to reframe. You know, sometimes people, I've heard a lot of commentary from people who are like getting quote unquote sick of people they're hanging out with and in quarantine, or, you know, they're missing their family and everybody's just really jonesing to get out and see our friends and family members we're separated from. But that being said, I think putting this human perspective back on things really helps level set. And to your point about, you know, the supply chains, right? Like not just the creation of the products, but like how something actually gets to you, right? Like people are starting to appreciate their delivery drivers more and understand, you know, none of this is magic. And I think, unfortunately, Amazon has put us in a world where we've just like this one-click motion to get something from our doors. I mean, sorry, from a warehouse to our doors really quickly without thinking too much about the supply chain. Of course, things have come out about the way warehouse workers are treated there, and there's all sorts of just vectors there. But I love this point, Liz. I think it makes a lot of sense to kind of help ground us and help and help us get back to thinking positively. I was going to say get back to normal, but that is not happening anytime soon.
So my other question, and we touched on this just a little bit, but in terms of some practical things that we can do to be better stewards for the planet, how can we celebrate Earth Day, kind of given the current reality, but also beyond it as well?
Yeah. So how can we celebrate? Yeah, I think that. It's interesting because we're not celebrating, in a lot of ways it was kind of brands that were, I don't know, this is my experience as a retail reporter, but you know, it was lots of brands that were kind of helping to create this wave of interest in Earth Day and this excitement about Earth Day. And that's a good and bad thing, right? I mean, I think it's really good that brands and companies and startups that are sort of making ethical products and thinking about the planet are driving this. I think that's a great thing. But I think now the onus is sort of on us to make this kind of a personal thing, and to, instead of, you know, as you're saying, like joining an earth cleanup, sort of a sea cleanup, or, you know, or picking up litter, or doing some sort of like organized activity, we can, that we need to sort of take responsibility for ourselves and sort of make this our own thing. And I think that there's like a great opportunity here to sort of cultivate like, and sort of things that we can do with our kids within our own home, the way that we would celebrate some other holiday with our, you know, with our families. So this entire Earth Week, my daughter has been doing little Earth activities, basically to help her feel like this is kind of an exciting holiday. Like she just had Easter. And that was something she looked forward to, and like she, you know, planned for, and, you know, was excited about all these activities. We're trying to do something a little bit similar here. So yeah, so she's doing a little bit of recycling, and she's learning how to, you know, like she's just learning about like the earth, basically about it as you know, as something that's connected to her. Mm-hmm. And what makes her life possible, right? And so in some ways, I think that, you know, this gives us an opportunity to be able to turn this day into something that is ours, right? Rather than something that we're doing with everybody else.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, it's great to support ethical businesses who are stewards of the environment. There is this there's this climate neutral certification that's I think right now they have 102 brands there. There's the campaign just launched, but I like your point. It's great that there's companies, brands, as a society, people are kind of pushing us to think about it more, but it's up to us how we want to celebrate it. For me personally, and it's funny, we are planning an episode on gardening. Like, I've been gardening for a while, but I grew up around like my grandparents and my mom, like always in the countryside, always planting everything. And as an adult here in the US, I completely got disconnected with it, and I'm kind of reconnecting with it now. And of course, now during COVID-19, everyone is selling out of seeds. People definitely want to go and plant and spend some time outside, even if it's just inside their gardens. You know, planting a tree is huge, and obviously just the fact that we stopped commuting, stopped driving. That's like whenever you do those carbon emissions quizzes, like this is number one basically contributor to your carbon emission is how often you fly and how far you drive. Yeah, cooking a vegetarian meal, all right, just taking a bit more time to think about food, just because we're forced to cook 5 times a day or however many times a day, things like that. So since you write about brands, I know there is tons of research you're probably doing on a daily basis. We obviously have seen so many great examples of brands standing up and doing something good, both for the environment, but also like in response to COVID-19. I remember on the podcast episode, you had a great example, interesting example of how a brand is responding to this crisis. Have you seen any other interesting examples from brands?
Well, yeah, I mean, so I think a lot of brands are trying to take advantage of this moment to support like healthcare workers and things like that. I've seen a lot of really great stories about brands just donating products to healthcare workers. In some cases, it's more valuable than others. Like there's one shoe brand, for instance, that has designed these shoes that are that are designed for nurses. It's called Clove. And so they just did a big donation, and I think that was really helpful because nurses and doctors are on their feet all day. Then like Jelly Belly, the jelly bean company, did like million jelly beans to healthcare workers. I'm not sure they're going to appreciate that quite as much. I think there's been a lot of this. I would say though, if I can take the conversation a little bit negatively, I do think that this is an important time for brands to be very thoughtful and conscious about how they're responding. I know that everybody wants to do something, but we're seeing some situations where brands are just kind of they're doing things that they can't sort of follow through on. So there was this whole story about how Reese Witherspoon, said that she was going to donate dresses to teachers, and didn't like express how many dresses she would give away. And, it turned into this kind of national campaign, and many teachers didn't get, the dresses that they wanted. They were super disappointed. And then things like Jelly Belly, right? Like, it's like, is this necessarily the best use of, their resources? Like maybe could they have donated money instead that could have been used for something else, right? Like I'm just, I think this is a really important time for brands to be thinking about this. The other thing is that I think that consumers really appreciate when a brand is good to their employees. And so there's so many brands that are like on the surface doing something to support, healthcare workers, for instance, or, making donations or something like that. And they're simultaneously doing these very large, cuts, right? Because they're struggling, their businesses are struggling. And so they're laying off tons of workers or furloughing workers without paying for their healthcare and things like that. And so I do think that, in some ways that's like much more important. And I think consumers are aware of that if a brand, isn't like donating masks, but is continuing to pay workers that they furloughed. There's some brands that are doing that. Like for instance, Allbirds. Allbirds doesn't have any retail stores. And so all of their retail stores are closed now. Right. And so all of their retail work or anything. And so what they decided to do was they're going to furlough them, but they're basically looking at the government assistance that's going to these furloughed workers one at a time, seeing like what kind of and what kind of government payout they're getting. And then they're topping up whatever their salary would be so that they're not taking any loss to their salary than they would have before. I think that honestly, like hearing that makes me respect Allbirds so much more than like, you know, them donating shoes to workers, which they also did. But like between those two things, like I think that, you know, they're a business, right? Like, you know, their responsibility is to their workers, I think. And so brands that are doing that, I think that's a very important part of what they're doing.
Yeah, I have always been a bit skeptical, like outside of COVID-19, of brands. You know, whenever something happens, a crisis happens, and brands just donate the whatever products they're making. It's like you know, that's probably not the most effective response. You know, it helps. Yes, you're not making revenue on it, but you're still producing the products that you're making, or it's like part of the profits from this collection goes to it. They're just increasing the sales, but not necessarily doing the absolute best thing that is needed to respond to whatever given crisis. Yeah, Allbirds is a great example, and I absolutely agree with you. Like, Everlane is kind of getting into trouble. I think even Bernie Sanders tweeted at them for them, you know, furloughing and letting go a lot of people while, you know, they're known for transparency and stuff. So, but yeah, I think with this crisis situation, it's kind of like, you can you see everyone's true colors, and brands that are ethical and claim to be mission-driven brands, they will get even more scrutiny, and I guess for a good reason, right? Awesome. So folks, we will be finishing up our conversation pretty soon. Oh yeah, Emily's saying, and when you just donate a product you already made, it's a huge tax write-off. That's a good point. Smart.
The tax, it's like self-interested, and it's also you know, it's like a lot of these brands have all this excess inventory right now, and so it's self-interested on multiple levels. But also, you know, as we all know, free products are not very good for the planet, right? You know, if you didn't buy something, there's a good chance that, or if you didn't ask for something or want something, there's a good chance that it's not going to be used very well, right? And so, yeah, and so basically it's like, I'm really sad to think about all of the wrappers that are going to be thrown out, you know, and like, you know, that are going to get used. And so it's a terrible example in every possible way. So
got it. Anyways, so we're gonna wrap up in just a second. Feel free to either unmute yourself and ask a question, don't be shy, or you can post it in the not Slack, chat window in the
Chat, yeah.
And then I've been tracking comments inside the Facebook group as well. So much technology,
Yeah.
which is great. We're definitely in the best time possible to be able to deal with this situation in terms of technology. Alrighty. Oh, Emily is asking, did you guys see that Tix was giving gift cards to anyone who made masks for healthcare workers? I haven't seen that. Tix is a shoe brand, you guys?
Yeah. Shoe brand. Yeah. That's neat. I mean, you know, if somebody wants to use it, then they can, right? And Teaks are very expensive.
Okay.
I wanted a pair, but they're quite expensive.
Got it. All right, Laura, do you have any other questions? I think
I don't think so. I mean, Liz, I was just sitting here just taking mental notes to have a scribbling some stuff on my notebook. There was so much actionable and really thoughtful information in this conversation. I think, you know, the fact that you're able to show, you know, trends from the way you see them as kind of a reporter on the front lines is really fascinating. So thank you everybody so much for joining us. Thank you, Liz. So we will make this recording available on YouTube. Sorry about the Facebook issues, but we got them worked out. So yes, looking forward to seeing everybody here next Wednesday, same time, and happy Earth Day to everybody. Please, you know, go out and celebrate the Earth whatever way you can. And we will drop a link to Liz's book also in the Facebook comments. And it's also on brightly.eco/coffee. So
yeah, awesome.
All right. Thanks so much, guys.
Bye.